More than 20,000 people gathered for a large outdoor music festival. No one could have anticipated the nightmare that was about to unfold then. Then over the music, they started to hear what at first people thought were fireworks. Complete panic erupted. Rapid gunfire rained down on the crowd, with shots so close together that they seemed to almost bleed into each other. Concert goers ran in every direction, searching for cover where there was none.
In a split decision, the U.S. Supreme Court has struck down a Trump-era ban on bump stocks for firearms.
You can argue how they interpret it, but here's the bottom line. They're dead wrong, and they're dead wrong for America.
Ruled the current ban on bump stocks is unconstitutional. Critics have long pushed to keep a bump stock ban in place.
Overview of H.R. 8600 bill. Representative Lucy McBath introduced H.R. 8600 to shake up America's gun laws. This bill doesn't focus on the aesthetics of your gun, but on the mechanics, specifically gas-operated semi-auto firearms and high-capacity magazines that fire rounds rapidly. The bill aims to regulate these firearms and magazines more strictly. It sets up a list of banned items, meaning some popular models might no longer be allowed. It also requires new designs to get government approval before hitting the market, ensuring they meet safety standards and can't easily be modified into more dangerous weapons. Think of it like your favorite car needing government approval before being built. This bill takes gun safety seriously, aiming to prevent these firearms from becoming bigger threats or falling into the wrong hands. If H.R. 8600 becomes law, expect changes in the gun aisle. The focus will be on limiting risky firearms. Whether you support or oppose it, this bill is sparking significant debate about balancing rights and safety. Criticism of H.R. 8600 bill. Critics of H.R. 8600, spearheaded by Representative Lucy McBath, are voicing serious concerns about its potential impact. They believe this bill could significantly alter the gun ownership landscape. Here's why they're up in arms about H.R. 8600. Critics argue that H.R. 8600 targets not just fringe firearms but a wide range of semi-auto guns. These are guns many Americans use for self-defense, hunting, and recreational shooting. They worry that the bill's focus on safety could outlaw firearms that are legal and responsibly used by millions. Their main concern is how the bill defines what makes a gun too dangerous to own. By focusing on the internal mechanics and the potential lethality of a firearm's design, they fear H.R. 600 could ban guns based on their construction, not their appearance or use. This could mean that semi-auto rifles or pistols common in home and gun clubs could become off-limits. Critics also argue that the bill, while focusing on gun restrictions, doesn't address the deeper issues behind gun violence. They believe tightening regulations would solve the root causes of gun crimes and might unfairly penalize law-abiding citizens who use guns responsibly, doing little to curb illegal gun activities. At its core, the criticism revolves around Second Amendment rights. Critics see H.R. 8600 as potentially overstepping by restricting access to firearms that Americans have long considered their right to own. They argue that any legislation restricting these rights should balance its impact on public safety and individual liberties. In essence, while H.R. 8600 aims to make America safer, critics fear it might erode constitutional rights and miss the mark on addressing the real drivers of gun violence in communities. Concerns about constitutional rights. Opponents of H.R. 8600, like many Americans, are fired up about what they see as a direct hit on their constitutional rights. At the heart of their argument is the Second Amendment, the famous clause that guarantees the right to bear arms. They're waving the flag on this one, saying that the H.R. 8600 could trample on those rights like a bull in a china shop. They believe the Founding Fathers wrote the Second Amendment with a clear purpose to ensure that ordinary folks could protect themselves and their families. It's not just about hunting or sport shooting, it's about having the means to defend against any threat, including potential government overreach. To them, owning a firearm isn't just a privilege, it's a fundamental check and balance in our democracy. So when H.R. 8600 comes along and starts picking and choosing which firearms are okay and which are off limits based on how they're built or how lethal they might be, opponents cry foul. They argue that any law restricting access to guns goes against the very grain of what those constitutional protections are all about: individual liberties and the right to defend oneself. It's not just about the practical impact of fewer guns, it's about the principle of the thing. They see H.R. 8600 as a slippery slope, fearing that if this bill can limit certain types of firearms today, what's next? Will more restrictions follow, eroding their rights bit by bit? In their eyes, the Second Amendment isn't something to be tinkered with lightly. It's a cornerstone of American freedom, and any legislation that threatens it should be met with fierce scrutiny. They're not just arguing for the sake of owning guns. They're fighting for what they believe is a fundamental liberty deeply rooted in the history and values of this country.
Well, I've got here the actual original brace, and so you had to implement this rule. Are you telling me that this brace is exempt from your rule? You're not exempting the same brace that you gave this letter to.
If the brace is submitted, we'll classify it.
It's pretty obvious you're misleading people here when you say that the brace has changed, because your rule affects the braces that didn't change. You tell us here today how many people have complied by registering this product.
I believe it's a statutory maximum of 10 years.
10 years for owning a piece of plastic that you were told was legal?
Practical implications and feasibility. Critics of H.R. 8600 aren't just worried about the theory behind the bill. They're raising serious practical concerns about how it would actually work in the real world. Here's their take on the nitty-gritty details. First off, they're scratching their heads over how you'd enforce such strict rules in a country where guns are practically as common as apple pie. America has a long-standing gun culture, and millions of citizens legally own firearms for various reasons, from protection to recreation. Trying to tell all these gun owners which firearms they can keep and which ones are suddenly off limits could be like trying to herd cats on a roller coaster. Then there's the issue of enforcement itself. How do you police the modifications people make to their firearms? Many guns can be tweaked and tuned in countless ways, and figuring out which modifications are legal and which aren't could become a bureaucratic nightmare. Critics argue that this could create a black market for illegal modifications or even encourage people to find ways around the law, defeating the bill's purpose. And let's not forget about the sheer number of firearms already out there. With millions of guns in circulation, some dating back generations, critics wonder how feasible it is to track and regulate all of them. They fear that the H.R. 8600's provision could create unintended consequences, like pushing more guns into unregulated markets or sparking legal battles over what qualifies as compliant under the new rules. In short, while H.R. 8600 aims to tighten the reins on gun ownership for safety reasons, critics worry it might end up tangled in logistical challenges and unintended outcomes. They argue that any law this sweeping needs to be practical and enforceable without creating more problems than it solves. Balancing safety and constitutional rights isn't just about what's written on paper. It's about how it plays out in everyday life for millions of Americans.
Not because of rank-and-file law enforcement doing their job, but because somebody made a leadership decision in order to execute a warrant in the most... You can sell 6 a.m. and standard operating procedure. You can do that everywhere else. I've represented 3 officers and officers-involved shootings. I spent 10 years. I know the facts of this case. I know where the guy worked. I know that he was surveilled. Right? If you have a gun and you're a prohibited person, that's the crime. There doesn't need to be intent. There doesn't need to be any of those things, right? I said earlier that ATF's responsibility is to implement the laws that Congress passes.
34.
Congress passed a law. They didn't. When did the U.S. House pass a rule classifying a pistol brace as a short-barreled rifle?
Public safety and crime. Opponents of H.R. 8600 are sounding the alarm on how the bill could impact public safety and crime, and they're not mincing words. Here's their take on the potential fallout. First off, they argue that H.R. 8600 could hit law-abiding citizens the hardest. These are the folks who own guns for legitimate reasons like self-defense, hunting, or sports shooting, and they argue that tightening regulations might leave these responsible gun owners feeling like they're sitting ducks. By restricting access to certain firearms and imposing stricter rules, opponents fear it could hinder their ability to protect themselves and their families effectively. Critics also point out that criminals, by definition, don't follow the rules. They're already willing to break the law, so making it harder for law-abiding citizens to own firearms isn't likely to put a dent on criminal activity. Instead, they suggest that stricter regulations might create a false sense of security while doing little to address the root causes of crime. Moreover, opponents worry that reducing access to firearms could have unintended consequences for public safety. They argue that responsible gun owners can actually contribute to community safety by deterring crime and providing a means of defense in emergencies. By limiting this access, they fear it could leave law-abiding citizens more vulnerable to criminals who are undeterred by gun laws. In essence, while H.R. 8600 aims to enhance public safety by tightening controls on firearms, opponents argue that it could backfire. They believe it might disproportionately impact those who follow the rules while failing to address the underlying issues driving gun violence. Balancing the desire for safer communities with the rights of individuals to defend themselves remains a contentious issue in the ongoing debate over gun control legislation. That's all for this video, folks. See you next time.